All right, good evening, listeners. Welcome to Motley Crude, episode number 34. As per usual, I'm Kevin, and with me this evening, I've got Andrew. How you doing, buddy?
Good.
Awesome. And then in replacement of Ryan, who's had some unforeseen family-related circumstances pop up, we've got Danny with us. Returning Danny. How you doing, buddy?
Always good. Always good.
Awesome. So this evening, we're going to be going back to our long-awaited second segment of our the Old World Fundamentals episodes. So we're the second one in the series. We're going to be talking about movement and target selection. Before we get to that, however, let's do a bit of a roundtable on how everybody's hobby has been going over the last 2 weeks since we recorded. So, Danny, what have you been up to?
I haven't been up to too much lately. A few weeks ago, I started running. There was an event locally that I ran, but had to drop out due to family issues. Then Ryan was nice enough to take over. But you guys did cover that recently. Besides that, probably about the same time, I ended up smashing my hand on the edge of a table and fractured a bone in my hand. So my hobby has been down lately, and because of this, I'm realizing that my little side project of painting up a Kislev army had to kind of stall. And if I want to have a fully painted army for Toronto, like SBOT, I had to kind of swing back to demons since I already have a large portion of that ready.
Yeah.
And then I've been looking at them again with the new 1.5 update, trying to figure out some new units since before it's a little bit different now with how the objectives work. So I'm just trying to get a good idea of what units are better at holding objectives for the strategic points, some that are good for grabbing objectives or getting the baggage green and holding the hill. So just trying to figure out that along with just, I think Val also mentioned it might be 2,200 points. And 2,200 points allows me to take 2 soul grinders, which has me excited because they're 255 points a model. So they're 5 points too many points to fit in.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm kind of excited to try that. Besides that, I did play a game a couple days ago.
Yeah.
Against Into Wood Elves, trying out a trial list with a bunch of Daemonettes that I purchased a while ago. So
And how did that go? Yeah.
It went all right. Magic was definitely the downfall of my army, or one of them anyways. I didn't really have any answers to Double Dragon.
Yeah.
So I tried avoiding them for a while, and the magic just, I think, first 2 turns, or at least the first turn, I failed all my spells. I had 2 skull cannons shoot, and both of them misfired. I think for the first 2 turns, just kept misfiring over and over again. So it was a little rough at the start.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it was still a fun game. I ended up losing it, but definitely held the objectives because we did the strategic points. Nurglings scouting onto an objective. 7 wounds a model. You got 4 of them on there. That's 28 wounds just sitting on an objective with 5+ regen, or 6+ regen and a 5+ ward.
Yeah, that's good. Like a pile of wounds with scout is pretty good in the new.
Yeah, so I think
especially if it's in core, right?
Yeah, that's the biggest thing was I had them in core. So with the update. So I think it was a lot of fun. Definitely kind of reinvigorated the demons building again. So I probably will be bringing demons to Toronto and trying them out a little bit more. I'm hoping to see if I can get a game in tomorrow night to try out another variation on the list. But besides that, not a whole lot of actual painting because hard to hold a paintbrush right now with a
with a smashed hand. Yeah.
So
I think in your list you're looking a little bit more at Nurgle models now. Is that because like they play the mission a lot better than the other flavors of demons, or?
Right now I'm looking at demons just for strategic points, like just to sit on the objectives. Like the plague bearers are like T4, 5+ ward, 6+ regen.
Yeah.
They do lose the regen from magical attacks, but they're not super common. Like with magic missiles kind of going down, with spellcasting not as popular as it once was. There'd probably still be some build like think they'd be a little bit better. So because of that, I think they're a little better. They also get the regen on their when they disappear from the warp, from the instability.
Yeah.
Which I mean, 6+ ward, you might get 1 or 2 back, but it's still something.
Yeah, sure.
And Nurglings are just, as we said, pile of wounds. But
Yeah.
I did look at Daemonettes and Pink Horrors and Bloodletters. I think are just too brittle. The Horrors, same thing. They got the spell casting. They can get a +4 for their bound spell. They're
Nice.
okay.
Yeah.
But then Daemonettes, they're fast. They got a couple cool tricks that you can do with them. I think the big thing was like a BSB banner that's just minus D3 to your weapon skill and initiative, which I think is a lot of fun in a big block. But it
Yep.
feels like a Death Star that's not too durable.
Yeah.
Which was to the issue. Like it can chew through a lot of stuff, but as soon as it's more than T4, it's gonna struggle.
Especially if there's like more than one charging you at once or whatever.
Then it's gonna go downhill real fast. But it's still fun to kind of change things up.
For sure. Okay, cool, good stuff. Andrew, on your end, what's been new in your hobby?
The same thing that I has been for the past 3 months. So I'm still working on CCBB stuff. I finished one more table. This one is the one I wanted to make for like the longest time. It's like a all graveyard table. So like the main line of sight blocker is like a big mausoleum / chapel. All the forests
Nice.
have like tombstones and stuff in it. The dangerous terrain or difficult terrain is like more tombstones and like a couple little mausoleums. Then the hills, I did a lot of like sort of flat tombstones on it, like the ones that are kind of laid on the ground. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah.
And then, because that way you can still place like movement trays on it without it being all like janky.
Yeah,
And
difficult to
then-
work with. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I carved like open graves in it as well.
Nice.
Because again, the holes are too small to actually affect like movement trays going around. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I did attach 2 mausoleums to the sides of the hills, so you're just gonna have to figure it out. But rule of cool on this because it looks badass, but like it is gonna get in the way if you're trying to move through it or whatever. And I don't want to have like rules for multi-type terrain pieces. So I'm just gonna basically tell people to ignore the ones that are on the hill, but it looks badass, so I really don't give a fuck. Like, deal with it. And then for the table I'm working on for you, I kind of figured out how I'm gonna base everything and also have it kind of like look good. So
nice. Yeah, I'm excited to see that table.
Yeah, I found like it took me a long time to figure it out. Like how to incorporate the lava into sort of like the forest bases.
Yeah.
And the difficult terrain.
Did you do like trees for the forest, or is it like spikes of stone or something?
I found these like pretty decent looking STL files of like trees without leaves.
Okay, like burnt out trees, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna paint them all burnt out and kind of like have like the bottoms glowing a bit from the lava around them. So like that part's fine. It's more like the area templates that I used to like delineate the edges of the forest as well as the difficult terrain patch. Like I was kind of having a hard time doing like how I was gonna do the lava effect without it looking like really strange. But I think I've come up with a good solution. I don't want to tell you what it is because I kind of want to just show you the table when it's all done, so you'll be like, "Oh fuck, that's sweet." But maybe
let's go for that. Yeah.
Maybe when it is done, I'll take a bunch of pictures and throw them up on Instagram so the people listening can see. But I'm pretty sure my idea is gonna work out. I'm actually just working on it right now as we talk. And I'll be able to start painting all of the hills and bases for those area sections tonight after the podcast.
Nice. Yeah, I'm excited to see those. I guess in like what is it, 2.5 weeks maybe at 2 weeks. 2 weeks at CCBB.
Yeah, it's 2 weeks. We're like right down to the wire now. So
yeah. And I've still got a lot of painting to do, so it's a good segue for me. So I had a really busy hobby period of the last 10 days. So I painted and based 30 hobgoblins for CCBB, and I'm about like a third or a half done on the next 10 too. That is like a breakneck speed for me. Like I've never painted this fast in my life. I'll tell you guys, I don't like it at all because it's super shitty painting. It's like just blocking colors in and moving on. Like I do not like it at all. But you know, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, I guess. I don't think I'm gonna have time to do all 120 before the event, but like we'll see how close I get. I could definitely get like 2 big units done. I'm not worried at all. And then, you know, depending on the actual lists that I run, I can drop them down from 40 to like, it just depends on the list. Sometimes it's like 38, 37, 36 or whatever. And then over 3 units, maybe that'll be like a dozen models I don't need to paint or whatever. And that'll just be enough to get me across the finish line. So yeah, we'll see how close I get. But yeah, a lot of hobgoblin painting for sure has been going on here. And then aside from that, and the way that I'm painting them is like I can actually go back and just finish them later if I want. So it's not wasted or anything. And then I did play 2 games also in there since the last time we recorded. So I played 2 wins. The first one into Errantry Crusade, and then the second one into Wood Elves. So Danny, I played the same player you played just earlier in the week with a different list.
He told me you kind of workshop the new list.
Exactly. And then I played into and then my game into Errantry Crusade against Brian was a lot of fun. Like this is going to be a bit hard to explain without any sort of visual aids, but there was just this wacky Warhammer situation that came up where like my unit of 100, like my unit of hobgoblins with like 170 points basically rolled up the whole Bretonnian army, or most of it anyways, and killed like 1,100 to 1,200 points in like a round of combat and then a flee after. So basically I had one of my seneschals on Great Taurus flank charge a unit of Grail Knights. There was a challenge. I killed one, and then they sort of stayed there, gave ground. Then I got charged in my flank by a big Peg Knight bus. And there was a challenge declared by his Duke to just kill my Seneschal, which, you know, was statistically going to happen for sure. He only did 5 wounds out of the 6, left me on 1 wound. And then like the next turn, so my turn came around. And I rolled super well on my leadership roll, so on my break test. So my Seneschal stayed in combat, just hemmed in between Grail Knights and a big block of Peg Knights. And then in my turn, my hobgoblins charged from the other direction into the Grail Knight bus. My Seneschal got absolutely obliterated by the Duke, but because he was on 1 wound, he just gave, and how the new mechanics work for like challenges, he only gave up a single point of combat res because of when he was killed or how he was killed. And then my hobgoblins basically did a number on the Grail Knights, and then had like massive static combat res 2 in the flank. So like just 1 combat by like a ridiculous amount, and he failed all his leadership, his break tests, and then in his turn he failed to rally, and my hobgoblins charged again the Peg Knight bus, and it was forced to flee, and it fled off the board. So like the hobgoblins basically picked up something like 1,200 points between a big unit of Grail Knights and a big Peg bus with characters. And that I'm going to keep telling this story for a long time, Brian, if you're listening. So next time we play, I'm going to keep reminding you of this. So yeah, that was a fun one. Like super, super unlikely, but it was just a fun one for sure. Okay. So that was the hobby roundtable. Moving on to the news, there's not much to discuss this week. But I think we're going to start getting some previews, like either almanacs of the upcoming Arcane Journal, or maybe some leaks even in the next few weeks. So stay tuned. We'll probably have something to discuss over the next few weeks. So let's move right on to our main segment for this evening. So we're going to be talking, as I mentioned in the intro segment there, about movement and target selection in the old world as 2 like key foundational skills or things you have to master in order to just do well at the game. So our last episode, you guys are going to have to go all the way back to episode number 8, which was we did list building and then we did deployment. And I think like just as a quick recap, in case you don't want to like stop this and go listen to it right away, we so like the big takeaway we had from list building is that your overall design philosophy for your list needed to be cohesive and everything needed to build together and synergize well to allow you to meet sort of your win conditions. And then when we talked about deployment, it was also sort of feeding from list building. How do you deploy to sort of enable your game plan and then win your game from that? That is like a 15-second recap of that episode. Okay, so with that in mind, moving on to the next step, movement, as it were. So let's start with Andrew. So Andrew, what are your like overall thoughts on the movement phase in the old world? Like how critical or not, I guess, do you think it is to the game? Do you think that the old world is a game that's won or lost during the movement phase? And then how do you especially when you compare that to other game systems you play?
I think movement is very much important to the game. Definitely, it is probably one of the deciding factors on, if you do win or lose, depending on your placement. If you're, matching up your units against the ones you want to across the board, either through movement or, I guess deployment's part of that as well. And now with the inclusion of, strategic locations or table quarters and things like that, like movement's even more important now, just making sure you have, paths to get to where you want, being able to use your units to block out your opponent from getting to those spots. So like definitely like board control and movement is a huge aspect of the game. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I agree with you entirely, Andrew. I think actually movement is the number one, like most critical element to doing well in the old world. I think it's certainly more important than like list building or how lucky you are at rolling dice in close combat or whatever. Like I think it's absolutely the deciding factor. The game is very much because movement is so constrained. Being able to maneuver your units into the right positions, not make mistakes with their positioning, force your opponent to make mistakes in return. Like those things win and lose games. Like just misplacing your units so that you can't charge because you have to hit yourself, or just like those silly maneuver bits that happen in the old world, like will win or lose you games. So I think definitely if like you're trying to improve at this game, trying to master the movement phase and thinking about movement in general is probably the part where you're the place where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in terms of improving. Like I cannot overstress. And then when I think of other game systems that I've played, whether that's like if we stay within the GW world, like Age of Sigmar or 40K, I think that in those games, because of how essentially everything moves like a skirmisher, to make this simple, movement is a lot more forgiving than it is in the old world. So I would say compared to other game systems, movement is even more of a big deal in this one. Danny, what are your thoughts on just overall how movement works?
I mean, you guys covered everything for the most part. Like, I guess the big thing for me is like if you're playing the game, you're still relatively new. Movement is definitely the key thing you should be thinking about, and best way to improve your game just overall. Because you can bring a bad list, you might deploy kind of poorly, but if you can recover with the movement, move your guys out of the bad charges, or like you're about to be charged, like okay, I can wheel, kind of get out of here. Like it's probably the place that you're gonna see the most reward for improving on.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so moving on a little bit here. So I mentioned this quickly before there, but during our list building episode, we talked a whole lot about, design philosophy behind your list, so making sure that your list actively works well together and cohesively together, and none of the items that you put in your list detract from the overall plan. So I'm going to go right back to you, Danny, on this one. Like when you're building a list, does movement, so, relative speed of your units, whether they have fly or not, what formations they can adopt, whether they have Swift stride, that kind of stuff, is that something you actively consider during list building? And then how does it impact the choices you're making in your army?
It definitely like for me, like if you have some units that are fast, you want if you're taking those units, you want them to either be a supportive unit, so they're holding back with your infantry or your slower moving units, and then they're kind of there as support. But if you are sending something in that's quicker, hopefully it's able to solo some stuff. Like I know a dragon going in by itself can do quite a bit, or some large monster they can relatively tank quite a bit. But if you're just setting up like 8 knights by themselves, yeah, they're quick, but are they going to do much by themselves without the rest of the army there? So you kind of have to
Exactly. Yeah.
plan for those things. Kind of okay, have some support with that, or don't just send everything as fast as I can to your opponent because that's just not going to work out.
Yeah.
But I think it's during that list building, it's actively thinking, okay, I have my core. It probably going to be positioned in a certain spot. And then if I'm going to have something faster, should I plan to add a character or some extra punch to it, or some banners, some magic banners, any number of things. How about you guys?
Yeah, that makes sense. Andrew, before I go, do you want to give this one a shot?
Yeah, like I mostly agree with Danny. I guess for me, speed of units or movement is less something I consider at list building. It's more when I'm looking at list building, it's more like what purpose does this unit serve? So if I do need something very fast and hard hitting to go out in front of my force to deal with things, or, in terms of a dragon, something that could be sort of a um quick unit that can bail me out of bad situations. Say I
Yeah.
move a unit poorly and they're about to get charged. Well, maybe the dragon can go sort of fix that situation for me by either, getting in the way or charging that thing that's going to threaten my unit. Um, I guess overall, I do think a little bit about like how fast the units are in comparison to each other. So like I don't want, like Danny said, one unit of say knights that are just going to run out in front, and sure they're quick and can do stuff, but they're really not able to do everything alone. And if the rest of my army's, still just pushing out of my deployment zone, like that unit of knights probably isn't going to be able to do too much. So I do kind of think about, how the army's going to move up the board. But
Yep.
like generally, no, I'm not like 100% focused on, how fast relative to the rest of the army each unit is, unless it has
Yeah.
a specific role.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I'm not I don't disagree with you entirely. I think I'm gonna cover some of the same points here, but like so I think movement is super important when you're designing your lists. And you have to make sure that your units just fill roles in the plan that you've got for the list overall. And then there are like times when people or me or you or whoever there will put things in their list that just doesn't work in that context. And it's a bit hard to describe, but I think it works well with examples here. So, if you have an aggressive sort of threat overload type list, then having some slower units or like some big blocks of whatever in that list that move slowly is going to be problematic, because as I think it was Andrew that said this, is some of those elements are just going to end up unsupported, and then they're just going to be picked apart, right? Like there's a huge amount of power in the old world in terms of concentrating your units against single points in the enemy army at the same time. And it's just really hard to do that or prevent that if different parts of your army just cannot keep up with each other or support each other, right? So, and then just like a real world example from last week when I played the game with Seb, the player that Danny also played, like the Wood Elf player, right? He had a good list with a dragon, a lot of Wood Elf cavalry, some pretty fast moving skirmishers to just run around the board and be annoying, and then a tree man in there. And then I was, the game hadn't even started, and I already knew in my game plan that I was beelining straight for that tree man because he was going to end up on his own regardless of anything else happening in the game, just because it had no ability to effectively follow the rest of the heavy hitters in his army. And that's exactly what happened. I got the tree man alone and was able to pick him up, right? Like, so you got to make sure that the things support each other. And then a bit like you, Andrew, I don't always think about it at first, when I first take a kick at building a new list. But over time, one thing we talked about in our list building episode was like making iterative changes to your list as you try it out and you learn things with it. I find that over time, when I don't consider movement enough in my list building, I tend to move in that direction, where ultimately, like, the final list after some trial and error ends up with units that are really aligned in terms of their movement speeds. So, to give you guys two examples. So in my pre-Renegade pack Chaos Dwarf list, which was because of the army list in general, very grindy and slow and quite a defensive type army. I started with wolf riders and eventually ended up dropping them because they were too flimsy, too often out on their own, and too susceptible to be being picked up because they just didn't mesh well with the rest of the army. And then Iron Demons were obviously a very big part of that army. And then inversely, when the Renegade pack came out, which allowed a much more aggressive threat overload type Chaos Dwarf list, I started with Iron Demons, but eventually moved away from them in favor of like Bull Centaur Tauruks, just because the Iron Demons were not fast enough to keep up with all the flyers and the aggressive bits of the army, right? So yeah, all that to say, I think it's really, really important to think about movement when you're designing lists, and it's probably actually one of the most important items. So yeah. All right. The next thing, I'll start with Andrew on this one. So one of the things we also talked about in our last Tactica episode is deployment. So how, like, do you plan out your movement when you're, before you start playing the game? Do you plan it out as early as during your deployment, or do you wait to see how things shake out to start thinking about the movement of your units, or do you place them sort of in a place where it'll allow them to move effectively as the game moves on? Like, how do you bridge the gap between deployment and then the movement that happens on later on in the game, Andrew?
For me, that happens a little bit more organically, and
Okay.
it kind of incorporates a lot of different things. So like, after, I'm already thinking movement after we've set up the table. I'm seeing like, okay, where's the like lanes where we can move units through? Where's like the areas where we're probably going to have combats happening? But then during deployment, there is that sort of, I don't know how you'd say it, like poker game of you each kind of putting out, maybe units that are chaff that you're not worried about where they die, to sort of weed out where the actual juicy bits of the army are. So as those like bigger targets in my opponent's army are finally being placed during deployment, that's when I'm starting to think about, okay, like that's where he put it. Now, how am I going to use movement to make sure I can get there or deal with that unit after it's placed?
Yeah.
But that kind of happens, like I said, organically as we're deploying our, back and forth with our units. And that kind of comes into fruition as we're sort of finishing up the deployment phase, just because we're both kind of trying to fish out like the shitty drops from each other.
The throwaway
before,
drops first. Yeah.
the throwaway drops, and then the same with like characters go last, so it's like, okay, where's the scary pieces in their army going to be placed, and that's usually at the very end. So like it's very hard to mitigate that during deployment, but then it's like, okay, how do I correct that or defend myself now during the movement phase, going into the first turns, from those units getting to me, or picking up the things that they want to.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you, Danny, how do you look at that bridge between deployment and then the movement you're doing after?
Definitely, I guess it depends on the mission. Like now with more widespread missions, it's definitely, as Andrew said, like as you're deploying, like seeing the terrain develop depending on how you're doing terrain, figuring out where the places are that you're going to foresee the battle take place. And pretty much, like if I have a faster unit, I know I can get around terrain, like either line of sight blocking or impassable terrain to try to get a flank. Yeah, I would say there's many different ways. I'm gonna have to pass over back to you there, Kevin.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Like,
Yeah.
I think you you hit on something key that I was going to talk about. Is
Yeah.
where you think the battle is going to take place, and I think that's like the most important element there. And it is something I think about during deployment because I've been caught with, for example, units being deployed too far out to the flanks so that they can't impact the game until turns 4 or something because they just spend half or more than half the game running around, making this big flanking maneuver or whatever. Like you can make some big mistakes during deployment. And I think it all just sort of boils down to what your plan is. And that's, you phrased it as where you think the battle is going to take place. I tend to look at it more a little bit in terms of like, so, I ask myself some questions when I look at my opponent's list and my list, like who's the higher mobility aggressive army that's going to be like the aggressor and who's going to have to be the defensive army and receive those charges, and then that'll help sort of dictate my deployment. And then in order to either be effectively able to catch my opponent if I'm on the defensive side, or being able to force the combats that I want as the aggressor, like will dictate where I place my units to allow them to move into those positions, right? So also what Andrew was hinting at, or actually just outright said, with regards to like at first you there tends to be like some throwaway drops, right, where you'll drop chaff or tax unit like core tax units or what have you, and then you sort of align to how your opponent is deploying. I tend to also follow that, right, where I'll know from my game plan if, for instance, the Black Orc War Boss and the 2-3 different seneschals need to charge and kill X, Y, and Z unit in my enemy army, then I'm going to position them to enable that movement, right? So it's really a thing that you do subconsciously. But if your deployment doesn't enable that movement after, you're gonna run into a wall, right? So yeah, that's how I see it, anyways. Okay, cool. Let's talk a little bit more about some generalities here. So when you're so start with you, Danny. So when you start off your movement phase, it's turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, whatever, and you start your movement phase, like how do you sort of look at that? Do you look at the board overall, like think about what you're going to do like cohesively? Do you look at specific units? Like what are you considering, and how are you deciding what you're going to do overall?
So for me, it depends on, again, what the units are going to be doing. So if I have some cavalry, okay, I know they can move a little faster. Is there anywhere they need to go? Do I need to get these units to a certain position to kind of threaten a flank or to support another unit? Or even, I guess the big thing is like, which happened in the game the other day, was I had a dragon facing off against my demon prince. There was 2 of them coming towards me. So I'm like, okay, let's check the arcs, see which way I can move before I do any movement. Can I get out of their charge range? Or if I can't get out of their charge range, can I get out of their arcs to like march a certain distance? As well as if I'm moving in units, I have to make sure that I know where they're ending and I know where my opponent's units are going to be able to move. Because if I move my unit, I'm like, okay, perfect, I can support this, but I forgot there was another unit. I didn't look at something, or it was just in the threat range or their charge range. I'm gonna leave myself high and dry. Where, okay, cool, they're in a good spot, but if I'm putting them in a spot to grab an objective or to flank charge something, and then I forgot to look back, oh wait, there's a cavalry unit or a skirmisher that's gonna charge my rear and then cause everything to go downhill. So it's definitely taking a look at your units where they can move, and then as well as also always take a look at where your opponent's units are going to be able to move on their next turn as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Before I go though, Andrew, what do you think on this one? How do you approach your movement phases like overall?
For me, it's more like how, like you said in sort of the last little part, how do I feel this speed compared to me and my opponent measures up, and who probably is going to be the one getting the charges off, or if possible, is there ways for me to move to mitigate maybe me getting charged, although a lot of the times I would prefer that me to get charged as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah.
Which sounds weird with elves, but it works for me for some reason. Um, so it's more like, okay, at least first turn, it's a lot of like, where do we, again, where's like the lanes of movement on the table? Where's the battle's gonna happen, and how do I get into position first or into an advantageous position for me when those combats actually kick off? That's kind of where I'm thinking. So it's like, how do I make sure my army moves up um, in a way that the units in my army are able to support each other when those fights happen. So that's kind of what I'm looking for is those bigger areas where I can redeploy my line to get ready to either engage with the target or let them come to me and we can battle it out then. So that's kind of the way I'm thinking of it when I'm playing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you hit the nail on the head, Andrew, when you talked about like taking advantageous positions there. I think thinking of your movement phase overall and making sure you put your units in those positions is really the key to success in this game, because when you think about it, the movement phase is really the only thing you have almost complete control over in the game, right? And it's the way that you ensure that your plan, or that you meet you set the conditions for your win, like your win condition overall for the match, stuff like that, right? So looking at it, I think with a view of looking at your movement phase with a view of how do I enable my winning later on in the match, I think is just critical, right? So for me, what that boils down to is I know what my game plan is, or I have a rough idea or a detailed idea, depending on the enemy list there, of what needs to happen for me to win a game. So if I go back to the example of the Wood Elf game that I played, last week, where my opponent had a dragon, a few units of Wood Elf cavalry, a tree man, and then just some skirmishers, right? I knew from the get-go, before we even started playing the game, that nothing in my army can fight the dragon, so I need to prevent those combats from happening as much as possible. I know that I can probably pick up that tree man and score a load of points because he's not going to be supported, and I can control who's going to charge him because of my greater speed. I know that the cavalry will just net me a lot of points and is pretty flimsy, so that's something I want to pick up too. And then I knew that I had to I didn't have much of a chance of getting all this running around skirmishers, right? So like I knew what was going to happen, and then in each of my movement phase, it's all about setting the conditions for me to meet some of those things, for some of those items that I need to do to win the game, right? So maybe if like turn one is a lot of just moving forward there, but after that, especially making sure that I'm not in the dragon's charge arcs with my army in general, making sure that I'm set up to charge that tree man, for instance, or that cavalry has some really annoying charges that they have to try to pull off and that they're in a vulnerable position. Like it's really about I guess it's really about building towards the sort of the end state of where you're trying to go to win the game. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. So let's move in. Let's zoom in a little bit here and look at individual units. So, let's start with you, Andrew. So you're in the movement phase. You go to move your, I don't know, your Witch Elf block or your Dark Riders or whatever. Like before you start moving that that individual unit, like what are some things you consider? Like, do you have an order to which units you're moving first? Are you looking at your opponent's positioning when you're moving? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, like generally there's an order. I run cold one, so stupidity is usually first on that. But it's more okay, thinking if this isn't a turn where I'm planning to charge or get into any engagements, I'm thinking of okay, say first turn, second turn, I'm going to be trying to set it up so I'm not blocking myself in. I've done it countless times where I've moved a unit in such a way that it blocked one of my charges and completely kind of fucked the game for me. So for me, I'm thinking like, okay, if we're going to probably be engaging next turn, I need to clear the path for everybody on my army, so those situations don't come up. I'm also thinking, like Danny said before, if there's something threatening my pieces, are there ways I could move out of those arcs? So especially with like Dark Riders, they play pretty close to the enemy lines most of the game. I'm trying to, get into flanks, get out of charge arcs, but still be able to, threaten with the ranged attacks of them. So, that's probably something I would do first. Maybe also use them as bait to try to pull things from my opponent's army out of place, so then the rest of my army can kind of jump on that target. But generally, like most of the time, I'm just thinking, don't block myself in. Go for those bigger open areas on the board with my units in a way that they can still support each other. That's kind of like my main thought process when I'm sort of going into the movement phase and making sure like I have that order of operations. So, if I have, a cav unit and then a foot unit, I got to make sure that the cav unit kind of goes out in front, because then they're able to get out of the way on those turns where the charges happen. Whereas, if I have the foot unit in front of the cav, I'm basically
Yeah.
negating any sort of bonuses that movement bonuses that that cav inherently has, because the foot unit's not going to be able to move in such a way that the cav can clear from behind them or even from the edge of them, right? So I'm kind of
Yeah.
thinking of how that happens on the table.
Yep, and you're right. That may sound a little bit basic, but like you're entirely right that people lose games, and I've lost games because I've gotten in my own way. And you'll know right away when you're playing. You'll come to your movement or your charges or whatever, and you'll go like, shit, I have X unit blocking Y, and then your whole plan falls apart, right? So that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that like movement is not forgiving at all in this game, and you've really got to be, I think, sort of clinical about it to have a good chance of, or maximize your chances of winning. Danny, how do you like manage individual units? Like, what do you look at? Is there an order? Like, how do you see that bit?
For myself, it's mainly, I guess, not the important units, but the ones like as I mentioned earlier, like the Demon Prince being potentially charged by 2 dragons. Um, I'm gonna use the ones that are either in danger first, like units that I got to rescue that are either too valuables. So I'm taking the brain, like my, I don't know, thought process to save
Yeah.
those units, get them prepared because charges are already completed at this point. I'm thinking of actual moving the units, so figure out how to get these units to safety, or if they're not in danger, how can I put them in a spot that's going to cause headaches to my opponent? Common thing I used to do, even for my bloodthirsters back in the day, was just throw them up a couple inches away, 2 inches away from my opponent. They can't move away, so then they're now, instead of me thinking about those things, causing my opponent to have to spend time. I'm like, okay, do I charge it? Do I try to get around it? Do I spend a bunch of magic to try to get away from it? And it kind of forces them to rethink what they have to do.
Yeah,
And
100%.
yeah, so it's. But I mean, Andrew pretty much covered most of it right there earlier.
Yeah.
It's honestly just, for me, what units do I really need to think about? Like having a unit of archers or something in the back, I'm not really going to think about too much. Like, okay, I'll move them. They're just kind of moving along the flank
Yeah.
or the side, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about it. I'm like, okay, nothing can charge them. Okay, they're good. But units
Exactly.
that are more in the heat of everything, I'm going to be spending time to figure out exactly where to move, measuring out distances, and
Yeah.
taking the time for those guys.
Yep, that's perfectly aligned with what I'm going to say, Danny. Like, so yeah, I think this is where really the heavy lifting happens in the game in terms of like thinking and just spending a lot of time looking at options and just trying things out. It's movement, like the movement phase and maneuvering and the different maneuvers you can use is really, when you're looking at your units, is like a puzzle you need to solve almost, right? And this is where I spend most of my time in the game, like just thinking about things. Like people call this like being cagey or whatever, in terms of how you move the units. But I think this is really like, it's really important if you want to be successful. What I do is like, there's really 3 things that I think about, and you did talk about them, Danny. You did touch on all 3 of them. So how do I keep this unit safe is the first one. How does this unit like score points is the second one. That can either be like being in a position to charge, shoot, or just score points now that we have like mission points there. And then the third thing is, how do I cause headaches for my opponent through my movement here? Um, in terms of like the order where I do this, for me, and this is just like a personal preference thing, I kind of use like, this is super common in Blood Bowl. When people play Blood Bowl, is I start with the easy stuff and the stuff I'm not going to screw up, a bit like what Danny was saying there, in terms of, he has an archer unit in the far back that's basically not going to impact much or be impacted by much. Like, I just get those easy moves out of the way, and then I just sort of dial into the ones that I really need to think about after. So yeah, that's sort of the order that I do it in. But like, that's just a personal preference thing for sure. And then like, yeah, one thing I want to touch on in a little bit more of a detailed manner is just causing headaches to my opponent. I think looking at the position of your units relative to the enemy is absolutely critical. You don't want to give them easy charges. You want to line up your charges, etc., all that kind of stuff. But I think one thing that is an important sort of skill set to develop, and Danny, you called it causing headaches, but I call it sort of threatening my opponent through maneuvering, right? So I like to think of ways that I can move my unit around to just force bad decisions on my opponent. So, put my unit in an like within charge range for the next turn, but outside of their front arc, preferably on a flank or something, where they just have to diverge from their plan and do something that they don't want to do in order to not give up like a bad receive a bad charge or whatever. Or I really enjoy with fast units like circling around the enemy army and then just causing problems that they're just really hard to answer, right? Because you got a whole army in your face, and then you've got a bunch of or several free runners in your back lines, just making everything that much harder for your opponent to sort of plan and consider and think about, right? And because I think we've all agreed in different ways so far, and we've talked about it in different ways, that like movement mistakes are super punishing in this game, then when you force your opponent to make make hard decisions, they're more likely to make mistakes that you can then exploit and leverage into getting you closer to winning the game overall. So yeah, just some things to think about when you're looking at your individual units and how you move them. Okay, let's talk about more like specific situations and how you consider them relative to moving your units. Okay, so I'll start with Danny, with you on this one. So the first one is, we just talked a little bit briefly about the opponent's positioning. Let's talk about threat ranges. So first off, Danny, can you give us a bit of an explanation on what we mean by threat ranges, and then how you consider your opponent's threat ranges when you're moving your army and your units?
Yeah. So usually a threat range, for when you're thinking about your opponent's models, it would be taking into consideration their movement plus any ranged abilities they have. So potentially, for a wizard, they might have a spell that's range 12. They're on a cavalry unit, so they can move 8 and then still cast a spell. So it's 8 plus 12, so 20 inches threat range for that ability. So if you're worried for something like, I can't think of the spell right now, the Beastman spell,
Wildtide.
Tide, yeah. That, I feel like that's one you really have to think about if you're bringing a dragon.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I need to know exactly how far it can move, and then I'm going to be just half an inch away from it, and make sure that I can still, that I'm safe from it. And it's honestly just measuring those threat ranges out. And so definitely it's something really you really should be thinking about at all times. So understanding what your opponent's army can do and what pieces you should be worried about. So if your opponent has Viletide, okay, I should not get anywhere near that with any monster, because if they have the Hag Tree Fetish with it, it's just gonna destroy stuff. I've had like the Bloodthirster die from it, like one shot, no problem.
Yeah.
So it's just, you have to make sure that you are able to stay away from those pieces, and know that okay, that has that kind of a threat range. You can also use dice, like, okay, I know it can get to here, it can get here. Okay, now let's go to the next unit. Okay, that can get there. So kind of plan out, tells you where not to go. So now I can move my units to other locations.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
yeah. So and that's something you're thinking about basically all the time when you're playing, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew, is it similar for you, or?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, I guess I'm a little more loose with it because I am looking to engage with the opponent as best as possible, but especially in those initial turns where I am closing the gap, I am thinking like, okay, I can't push too far forward yet because that's going to give them an extra turn of being able to shoot or pick off units that I have with shooting. Um, but again, like I do play kind of aggressive with my army, so sometimes you just kind of have to ignore those threat ranges and go into them and just hopefully either have so much target saturation that they pick the wrong thing to attack, or just hope you can tank it. Sometimes you do have to take those risks, but for
Yeah.
the most part, yes, that is something I do think of a lot because I need to make sure that the pieces in my army get to where they need to on the board safely so that they can be effective in the game.
Yeah. I agree, especially with the way like Danny was phrasing it at the start there. I think threat ranges are absolutely critical. And you're gonna, if you don't think about enemy threat ranges, there are times where you're just gonna lose the game, even turn one is possible, right? Sorry, Danny, you're making some a bit of noise there, but yeah. So like there'll be times when you even lose like the game turn one, just because some abilities are so powerful that if you haven't planned out the geometry of how they can hit you, it can really come back to bite you really fast. So like some examples, like Danny had a really key one. When you're thinking, when you look at your opponent's list and you see that he has that big as Beastman player, that big Viletide caster, that Viletide is from memory 15 inches. The chariot moves 7 inches again from memory, which is 22, right? So you got to know what's within 22 or what could be within 22 that could be hit by that spell, and then also remember to factor in other elements such as do they have conveyance spell, right? If your opponent has travel mystical pathways on that puppy, like that adds another 12 inches. Thankfully now it's wholly within there, but another 12 inches. So you're potentially looking at up to 34 there. No, yeah. So like try to think of those things. It could be the range of shooting on a big unit of Sisters of Avalorn or poison shooting. You don't see those anymore, but up till 1.5 there was some key threat ranges to know. And then like even for things that charge very fast, like those Peg Knights, right? You see them in a lot of games. You have to know that it's a 19-inch declarable charge range. Your opponent will tell you if you don't know there, but you have to know where you're positioned relative to that declarable charge range. Then consider things like Vanguard move, all that kind of stuff. Like this is super, super important. And you should always be thinking about threat ranges. And I would say, like, the way I do it is I just look at the key elements in my opponent's army, and those are the ones that I think about this stuff for. Like, you don't. It becomes a bit heavy to do this for every single thing in the game at all times. Like a lot of slow moving infantry stuff, like you'll just know, right? It's going to be 9 or 10 inches or whatever, and then you don't have to think about it too much. But like certainly for the big items, that they have, like they're big hammers, you need to for sure be tracking. Okay, so let's move on to another little bit that we talked about. I think it was last episode, me and you, Andrew, or maybe been the one before there, but like we talked about it. We talked about terrain, but how does let's start with you, Andrew. How does terrain affect your movement phase? Do you use terrain to support your movement overall, or impact your opponent's movement and game plan? Like, how do you how do you use terrain when it comes to moving?
So yeah, I try to use terrain very much in my movement um, in multiple ways. So like if there's a big line of sight blocking piece, I'm thinking, okay, can I use that to anchor a flank and, form up sort of beside it so that my opponent can't get in on me? Also, again, with those sort of line of sight blocking pieces, can I use those to screen my army from some of those, more scary ranged things like cannons, like, certain spells, things like that, that can put a lot of hurt on me from a distance. So can I use terrain um, to protect me from those things? And, sort of how can I move in a way that it benefits me defensively, but also doesn't stuff me up because, if my opponent can't see me through that piece, well, I can't see them through it either. So, I have to think about, okay, how do I use this piece of terrain and position properly so that, I get the benefit of it, whereas it's a detriment to my opponent. Other things I can consider too is like, we use patches of difficult terrain in our events. So it's like, okay, can I move in a way that my unit is between theirs with that piece of difficult terrain in between. So now if they want to charge me one, they might just fail that charge because they are picking the
Exactly.
lowest dice when they move through. So I can use that defensively as well to sort of protect a piece to ensure, or at least put it heavily in my favor, that they won't be able to, charge me or move in a way to get to me. So that's kind of like the ways I use terrain. Yeah, just mostly like screening and then defensively. Or like if I can move in a way to sort of take the most how do I say this? Like the most easy way to get somewhere so that my opponent now has to find an alternate path to get to that part of the board or to get in a threatening position, that's throwing them off their game because they can't get there. I don't know if I explained that properly. It sounded better in
Yep.
my head. But things, yeah, that's kind of how I use terrain, is either defensively or like, getting there first so that my opponent now has to find alternate routes to sort of get into the positions that they want to get into.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Before I go, Danny, how do you use terrain to supplement your movement?
I definitely use it to help some of the units that get kind of controlled by themselves. Units like that have the Impetuous or Frenzy. You can kind of have them positioned behind like a forest or a hill where they're not just going to charge out of nowhere and fly into your opponent's face. So I think it's a good piece right there. It's like another defensive piece that Andrew was talking about earlier. It's just using like difficult terrain like forests to position on behind them or even on them to gain some benefits. So your opponent is now going to struggle to get through those pieces. And it's making sure that as well, when you're behind them or in them, that they're not able to make contact by avoiding it. So not have like 50-50 out and then, oh, look, they charged and they didn't actually have to go through the train. So making sure that you're able to position yourself in the right spot.
Yeah.
As well as just in general, like deploying, you don't want to be putting your chariot through terrain so it just kind of falls apart on you. So making sure that you're avoiding it, avoiding anything negative that's going to happen to your army, which I know is not always possible, but it is definitely something to take into consideration, is just where you're placing your units and how you're moving them around the terrain.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, as well as like, I guess it's still more defensive. It's the I believe it's the difficult terrain that helps defensively with getting rid of rank bonuses, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they're in it, yeah. Same with
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But you,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think in general, terrain, you're right, is more defensive than offensive, but like it is super important. Terrain is super important in terms of it's like an enabler for your movement and something that can make your opponent's life a lot harder and hinder your opponent. It can help your plan, for instance, by hiding your unit from shooting. It can hinder your opponent from making their charges a lot harder. That's something Andrew covered. Being standing behind difficult terrain just makes charging much, much, much harder for your opponent. So we did a whole episode on how to use terrain and different types of terrain to win games. So point you guys towards that one if you're interested. But in general, like I could give an example. Like I've won games strictly because of how I've used terrain in conjunction with movement. So Danny, at your RTT 2 weeks ago, the third game against Frank, I think I won wholly because of using terrain and movement together, right? So I had a list that was very vulnerable to cannons because it's generally high toughness, but almost no saves, right? And my opponent had 6 cannons in his army, and then some hellblasters and some mortars and stuff. It was a Nuln army, so it was just a very, very scary matchup from the get-go. But by using terrain, I was essentially able to entirely remove his list advantage and sort of parlay that into a win. So, turn 1, I hid behind some hills in order to prevent him from shooting his cannons at my big juicy flying pieces that he wanted to gun down. Then turn 2, I hopped on the hill with all the flyers, because hills really limit the impact of cannons, because the moment, like, they basically have to land a perfect shot on your base as soon as they touch a hill. Otherwise, the shot is essentially failed, is wasted. So hopping on terrain to really limit the impact of that shooting, took a few wounds, but nothing really important as a result of that move. And then turn 3, I was in a position to charge his war machines at the back of his deployment area without having taken any actual significant shooting from an entirely gun line army. So yeah, terrain can really, really win you games, and it's something you should be thinking about definitely in terms of how to make life harder for your opponent, and then how to allow you to protect your pieces protect your pieces, or just advance your game plan in general. So perfect. The next one, I'll start with Andrew again. Let's talk about special formations and some special movement rules. Like, overall, what do you how impactful do you think things like skirmisher, fly, random movers, and swift stride are? And then how do you use those units with those special rules, or how do you employ those special rules to just sort of benefit your army?
I think they're all, very significant in their own ways. Skirmishers and flyers probably being the two biggest ones in the game, but even random movers are very powerful in their own right. They ignore basically all of the charging mechanics, and they just kind of auto move in and count as charging. But skirmishers, just being able to move in any direction, go where they want, not have to worry about you know flanking, or not flanking, but wheeling, and sort of the base mechanics of moving around the board with a rank and flank unit. Those are very powerful pieces. A lot of the ones, I guess, as elf player, is they're usually better at shooting than sort of the rest of the army. I've just started using shades, and they've been, I could probably use them a little bit better, but they have been like very useful tools in my toolbox. But even looking at like wood elves, they're way stalker guys or whatever, like they're super good at shooting. And then high elves live and die on the backs of the sisters. So those pieces can be very strong in those lists, just because they get to ignore a lot of the restrictions on moving that other unit to you. And then flyers, speed is king. And usually a lot of these flying units are heavy hitters as well. So I'm talking like dragons, peg knights, things like that. So being able to focus those really strong points efficient units, or defensive units, anywhere you want on the board, essentially, without worrying about intervening models, terrain pieces, and things like that. Like, that's also very powerful. And in a game where, we've said forever that movement wins you the game, being able to either skirmish and move in any direction you want without penalty, or fly, and God forbid you have both those rules, you get to ignore a lot of the downsides of movement, or like the harder aspects of movement, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my thoughts on it. Like, those are very powerful pieces to have. I have less experience with random movements. Maybe one of you guys can speak more
Sure.
to that, but I do know it's a strong ability.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to go, Danny?
Yeah, I can go. So I haven't for myself, I haven't used much of random movers yet. I did use it that one tournament. I was using the giant Caspon, and it is kind of a fun piece where is able to move quite fast. It can move quite fast, and it ignores quite a few of the rules, like
Yeah.
like walking into combat.
Yeah. Opponent charge reactions. Yeah.
Yeah, just getting rid of all that. The issue just becomes it's a little harder to control. Like you can't, well, at least with everything else, it's got a set movement. You can kind of plan. Okay, I can get to this distance. I can move here. With the random mover, I always found, at least from when I was using him, it was for me. Like I wouldn't use them. I think the skirmishers, like some of the smaller units, or the three, like anything that's got the 360, is a little bit more efficient with it. But I could
Yeah.
be wrong on that. Just because, like, oh, I need to move 8 inches. I'm using 3d6. I rolled a 3 or a 5, and it's like, oh, good. I can't really rely on it too well. So for me, like, that was something I could never. You kind of have to plan that. You don't know where it's going to go. But luckily, random movers is before compulsory movement, or it's compulsory movement is when random movers move, but it's the remaining
Yeah.
moves. So
Yeah.
you can kind of have that move, see where that goes, and then okay, it didn't get into combat. Okay, I might have to get other things out of the way because I was hoping that giant cast spawn was going to get into combat with that, and then my other things would be safe, just kind of stand there. No, okay, now I need to get my things out of the way, so you can kind of recover from it. But as Andrew said, like things like fly, skirmisher, like they just kind of make your units that were already kind of fast, or like just moving in general, just much more efficient. Like skirmishers
Yeah.
move wherever you want, fly. You're ignoring intervening models, terrain, for the most part, and then things like Swift Stride just kind of make you more efficient for charges and such. How about
Yeah.
you, Kevin?
Yeah, I agree with what you guys said. So I put these 4 rules there because I think those are some of the most important, like, force multipliers or like just benefit rules that you can have on units to really pump up their value and their ability to to do stuff in the game. I think finding as many instances of like Swift Stride, especially skirmishers, fly, random movers in your list is just going to give you so many more tools to play with when you hit the table that it's like is very, very important. So, I think especially for your hammer units. So, if your unit of goblins that's meant to catch, like to hold objectives, doesn't have like skirmishers, fly, random moves, Swift Stride, whatever there, that's fine. But if you're in, like, at the end of the day, this is a kill points game. What you're planning to do the killing with in your army, I think you are that needs, or as much as you can manage it, get some of these high value movement rules on that unit, right? So if you're planning to do, because otherwise you'll run into the hammer problem, right? Where like hammers are too scary to fight, but because they can't catch anything, everybody just ignores them, right? So having those kinds of rules on your big hammers units is super, super important. So just thinking like Swift Stride, I think Swift Stride is potentially the most impactful rule in the game. It is so powerful. I think it is too powerful. It was something we talked about. Me and Ryan talked about at length when we talked about quote unquote fixing the game. I think like Swift Stride lets you choose your engagements, which is really important, and then it lets you most oftentimes hit first, which is also super important. Lost a little bit of value with the 1.5 changes, but is still like a critical rule. And it just makes everything so much more reliable because you get that extra charge dice, you get that extra overrun dice, all that kind of stuff. Skirmishers, I think Andrew was again hitting the nail right on the head there when he said, skirmishers allows you to like, basically they're very forgiving, right? Like they're much less vulnerable to the opponent because they don't have arcs. If you mess up your movement, you can always fix it because you can head in any direction you want. Like they're just very, very forgiving units, which is great, especially if you're a newer player and you're just sort of feeling your way around the game rules. And then I'll say also skirmishers are just fantastic because another thing we were talking about, was threat ranges a few minutes ago. And because the skirmishers don't have threat ranges in like a a view, like an arc, a visibility arc in front of them, they have a 360-degree threat range. So if you couple that with something like Fly, something like Swift Stride, you can really zone out huge portions of the board with a scary skirmisher unit, and then your opponent is just has to really tiptoe their way around that, and it's really hard to deal with. Yeah, Swift Stride, Random Movers is a bit the same in that, like, it just creates this bubble of uncertainty where your opponent is like, ugh, I have to be careful about how close I get to this thing because, Danny, you were talking about the gigantic spawn. Like, if he rolls hot, I'm in danger within 18 inches, right? And I won't get a charge reaction. So, Random Movers are fantastic also. They, as a movement rule, and also as you also hinted at there, Danny, the ability to ignore your opponent's charge reactions is also super massive. So and then Fly is, it lets you pull off some really fun shenanigans in gameplay, especially for large targets with Fly. It gives you a lot of freedom, as Danny was saying, to sort of avoid intervening models. You can use it defensively to prevent charges. So what I'll sometimes do, depending on the situation, is I will put a large target, like a Fly large target, immediately behind another unit so that it can't actually be charged. But then it can charge on its own turn, on my next turn, just because it can see and charge over the intervening unit. So like you can do a lot of fun things with Fly, and it just generally really impacts your mobility positively. So so when I'm building a list, I absolutely look for Swift Stride, and then if I could get skirmishers in there, Fly in there, Random Movers, that's all fantastic. Like, I struggle to think of any really solid list that has no incidence of these rules, and I can't think of one. Like, they're just so critical to really allowing you to. I always talk about what your plan is for the game, but allowing you to be able to fulfill your plan or enact your plan is controlling movement, and it's done through these rules, I think. Okay, so we talked about the really important rules. Let's go to Danny here. Like, what do you think of some of the more utility type movement related rules? Like, how do you think about and how do you employ things like evasive, fire and flee, drilled, stubborn, shield wall, all those rules that sort of impact the movement phase? Like, are they something you build around? Are they something you you just see it as a little bit of a bonus? Like, how do you see them?
They're definitely all very strong rules. Definitely things like stubborn, stubborn, and shield wall are definitely things that you can employ on more of a tankier anvil unit, where you can kind of push them up, expect your opponent at you, and you can kind of control where that unit's going to go. So, okay, I'm going to lose combat. I'm going to get shift back 2 inches. So I know for my next turn, after he's charged me, my unit's still going to be there. So then I can plan for a counter charge. So I put my unit up. I then position my flanking units, 1 or 2, around just to kind of get ready. And I know my unit's going to, unless they completely get destroyed, like as long as there's a few guys there, that unit's still holding that other unit in place. Maybe they don't follow up, but they're still there. Like your opponent might not follow up, but like they're still there in that same spot. So it's a great rule to keep your opponent's units in place. Rules like drilled, like they're fantastic for knights or any fast unit, and just in general for things that exist. Like scenario baggage train, like you just have to make contact with it.
Yeah.
And have unit strength 5. So it's like, okay, cool. My unit of 6 knights, I'm going to switch to marching column. I move at 7 normally, so I'm going 21 inches across the table and get that. Or even still, like, okay, my unit was originally 6 wide. I want to avoid the terrain that's kind of in the way. So, okay, let me just drilled, get a little thinner. So I'm now 4 wide, or even before I charge, let me get a little wider, get a wider front so I can get more attacks in. So it's that rule definitely for cavalry, or just in general, is just a really strong unit. And rules like fire and flee, evasive, those are great for more lighter units that you're going to have up front. So if you can find those fast cav units or skirmishers that have fire and flee, evasive, they're going to make them even better. Like, all these rules just make your units significantly better. And it's definitely when you're planning planning to build some units, looking for units with these rules is definitely like going to help a lot. So yeah, they're all
Yeah.
very strong rules in
Yeah,
their own way.
Yeah, I agree with you, Danny. I think like these for me are so the ones before were like game defining rules, when you talk about things like Swift Stride. The ones in this category, I really think of them as utility rules. I don't really build my army around, let's say, Shield Wall or Stubborn. But when you do have it, they're just like good tools to have in your toolbox. If you remember to use them when it comes up, of course. But like they just open up some really fun options and some really effective options. I think that to like have more control over how you move and how you react. So I think the example you gave, Danny, was really good. Of something like Stubborn or Shield Wall just lets you control the game because it lets you set up counter charges the turn after, and it lets you plan a reaction to your opponent that is over 2 separate turns, because you know for sure that you're not fleeing, right? So then you're able to think, okay, well, my opponent will still be where I can charge it, like in a place where I can charge them or counter charge them next turn. And I don't mean counter charge the rule here, but like or just counter them next turn. Just being able to have that degree of control and confidence in what's going to happen it can be huge. And it can really open up some important and some effective plays. So same thing with stuff like Fire and Flee or Evasive or whatever. Like it just gives you options that you can bank on, and you can use to your advantage, right? Going to like the extreme, if you know you have Evasive, and going to the extreme range of like a shooter unit or whatever, like you can just bait things out and do fun little things with it. So yeah, I think they're good utility rules. They're not things I build my list around, but I will find ways to use it when the situation arises, for sure. Andrew, what are your thoughts on like these kind of, again, what I've called utility rules?
Yeah, like I think Drilled is very strong. Like Danny said, there's a lot of things you can do with it, going wide or getting thinner, especially with cav units. So like that one could almost even go back in the last category of being more like
Yeah,
impactful.
yeah,
Maybe less so than the other options up there. So I understand why you kind of put it in this grouping. Um, for me though, I haven't had a lot of experience with the other ones other than Fire and Flee. So like in Dark Elves, the Dark Riders can take that as an upgrade for 1 unit per 1,000. So usually in a 2,000 point game, I can have 2 units with Fire and Flee. And I almost use that multiple times every game with those units. One of my, normal quote unquote tactics is to move sort of just on that outside threshold of a unit's charge range, get my shots off, and then on their turn, when they come to charge me, I'll shoot and then fall back out of their possible threat range if they take the bait. So I use that to great effect. Even if I'm maybe a little too close, I'll still attempt it just because, chances are maybe I will. Maybe they'll roll low and I'll still be able to get out of being charged, but at least I'm doing something because Dark Riders are very fragile. So if they do
yeah.
get charged by anything, even semi-competent, like they're probably going to die unless my opponent rolls like super shit. So at least I have that option to do something constructive. I guess I could stand and shoot, but there's that outside possibility that I get away. So usually I try to do it on sort of the longer dice rolls or the longer charge ranges to use Fire and Flee. But I use that quite a bit with my army, and it is like a key component of keeping those sort of softer units alive.
For sure. Yeah, and I think like Drilled is you're right. It can potentially be more impactful, but it's a bit more like the level of impact you get out of it. It depends on the list that you have. Like I think it pairs extremely well with something like Cavalry, where you can you like leverage or really increase the impact of marching column with drilled and drilling into charges and stuff, like that is massive. But on infantry, with how the game rules have changed, where you get 2 ranks of attacks when you're charged, etc., like there's a bit less of a use case there for drilled, a bit less impactful. But yeah, I agree with you. It can be more impactful than the other rules there. Danny, thoughts on this one? Or did
Sorry,
I already cover you? I
yeah,
forgot.
you already covered me.
Oh yeah, my bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but then I'll give you the next one. So, what are some of the ways that you use your movement or maneuvering of your units to impact your opponent and fuck or screw with his plan and just make his life more difficult?
Well, I mentioned earlier, like taking the Bloodthirster or just anything like large and imposing, and just kind of forcing your opponent to think about it, like just marching it like 2 inches up, 2 inches away, or 1 inch away, and forcing your opponent to think like, okay, do I need a charge? Do I charge it? Can I make the charge, or not make the charge, but can I do anything against this, or am I just going to lose this combat? Or how am I going to maneuver to get away? Because you can position yourself where, like, okay, he can't go this way, so I'm going to force him because my Bloodthirster's there to now wheel around it or to go to a different way, so you can kind of force your opponent to decide to have to go a different way. There's all kinds of different ways you can throw in, like, okay, my opponent has some impetuous unit or frenzy units. Let me throw my like a skirmisher unit, not a skirmisher, like a fast cav unit, right at, like, okay, they have a declarable of 19 inches or 12 inches, whatever it might be, like infantry with frenzy. Okay, let me put it at the edge of their charge range. Therefore, they have to declare or take the impetuous test. If they pass it, or like they take the impetuous test, they fail, they have to declare a charge, but that charge is already probably going to be pretty hard unless they had Swift Stride. So you can do many things to kind of control your opponent's decisions, kind of force those plays.
Yeah.
Those are a few that I can think off the top of my head. How about you, Andrew?
For me, I do the same thing as Danny. So, like, one of my favorite plays to do, especially when I was running Battle Magic, is cast Arcane Urgency on my Witch block. So usually I'd start the turn too far away to declare charge with their Frenzy, but I'd know sort of what unit I want them to fight, which is usually every unit because they're pretty, with the Hag in there, they're pretty good. But I'd use Arcane Urgency to move twice, so they march 10, so that'd be marching 20 inches, and I'd just park myself like an inch or two right in front of the unit that I want them to fight. And now, my opponent immediately has to think, it's like, okay, do I just charge? And at that short range, like, chances are my Witch Elves are still going first. They're initiative 5, and on the first turn of combat, initiative 6. And then the Hag in there with the Ogre Blade is always strikes first. So I'm still gonna get my full attacks before he even gets to swing. It's usually a really daunting prospect for my opponent. And if they don't take the charge, well, even better, then I can just charge them. That kind of doesn't work now because I switched back to Elementalism, and now that I'm taking the Cauldron, I can't use that Spell Lore's version of extra movement, the fly one. So I might have to switch back to Battle Magic just to do that, even if Pillar of Fire is not as good as it used to be. That was kind of like my main trick. The other thing, like movement, like me using movement to like mess with my opponent's plans. I think we kind of already covered that, where I'm looking at terrain pieces to use to sort of fuck with their way they're going to move across the board. So, I'll use terrain to like block their charges or their marches. Like, I don't know. I'm not that great of a player compared to you guys, so like maybe I don't do more of the like cagey or high level tournament play stuff that wins you games by using movement to fuck with your opponent. Like I play very aggressively and kind of in my opponent's face. So usually I kind of forego a lot of the more cagey things.
Sure.
If that helps.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But you did touch on a lot of, I think, important stuff there too. A few things that I would add is like, so the first thing I talked about earlier in this episode is like threatening your opponent by maneuvering your units into positions that just make life hard for them. I think that's a super important skill to develop and use, and a way that I use to screw with my opponent's points, my opponent's army for sure. Moving around the flanks into the rear of his army with some fast movers, even if you don't intend to charge, it just causes headaches for your opponent. Just like it's just a really easy way to make your opponent's life much more difficult, and just give you some good options for future turns. Another way, is like messing with your opponent's charge arcs is massive. Like oftentimes armies will have 2 or 3 one sometimes big hammer unit that they're using to pick up points. Like this is really a kill points game, of course. So moving your targets out of their charge arcs is a basic skill that can pay some really massive dividends, right? So there's 6 turns to a game. Your opponent's not charging you turn 1, right? So every turn after that, where you move out of the arc of that big scary, I don't know, dragon or whatever unit you want to think about, like massive cab block or whatever it is, right? Every turn that you move out of their charge arcs, you reduce the potential output of that unit by up to 20%, right? Which is enormous when you think about it. And then you can do some really fun things too, like just like flying side by side with their big annoying monster or whatever, right? So then, or moving in to side by side with them, so makes it difficult for them to maneuver and essentially impossible for them to charge you because they have to stay outside of 1 inch. So just turning to face you is impossible. Like you could really do some annoying movement stuff for your opponent that way. One of the things that Andrew touched on, he was using Frenzy, but you can also use stuff like Impetuous and Frenzy against your opponent by just maneuvering or moving into places that are like almost impossible charges for them or extremely difficult charges, and then just sort of hoping, well, in the case of Frenzy, they don't have a choice, but in the case of Impetuous, sort of hoping that they fail that Impetuous roll, and then have to pull off some terrible charges that'll leave them stranded. And then you can exploit, like that's the thing you can do. Andrew also talked about it. Terrain, you can definitely use terrain, and we've talked about this a ton, but to screw around with your opponent's plan and their movement. So standing behind difficult terrain, for instance, or my example earlier of sitting on a hill, that was limiting the opponent's damage output, but nonetheless, like you can really use terrain to screw with your opponent. And then the last thing I'll say is, because there are a lot of it, we could go on and on with examples of how you can mess with your opponent's game plan. But for instance, ambushers and scouts, just force your opponent to deploy and move in a way that always sort of considers where your unit can pop up or where you've put your scouts in his backline or whatever. Like this is the reason why the Green Knight is such a, let's call it a Marmite piece that people either love or hate, is because you just have to think about it all the time because it could pop up anywhere and be really annoying because of how it forces you to move in a way that's overly defensive to protect yourself, right? So yeah, like all those are ways that you could just screw with your opponent's decision making through movement and maneuvering. And I think there's some super important tricks to have and be able to pull off if you want to increase and do better at the table or increase your odds of winning or whatever. Okay, so before we move on to like the other big item, which is target selection, Andrew, did I forget anything interesting, like in terms of strategies or tricks that you want to talk about relative to movement or something like that?
Yeah, I got one, and it's more like a suggestion is don't be afraid to flee. Sometimes that is the best way to do things. And there are, I guess maybe this could have been in the last sort of segment, but there are some tricks you can do. So like again with my witches and the dark riders in this case, sometimes to mitigate frenzy, I have to use those dark riders in the way. But I will move both units in a way that they're kind of far forward, and my opponent will elect to charge the dark riders. I've pulled this off a couple of times. I choose to flee with the dark riders. They flee through the witches, and because they're immune to psych, they don't care about that. And then my opponent either fails the charge but is now a much easier charge target for my witches, or they run all the way into my witches, which even better because now it's party time for them. So I have used that a couple times. It is like a little trick. I don't know how like highbrow of a trick it is, but it has helped me out a couple times to sort of push those combats to happen sooner than would have happened otherwise. So yeah, it's like don't be afraid to flee because sometimes that is the best decision too. Like if you've positioned yourself badly, and you don't want what's about to charge you to actually make contact because you probably lose that combat, fleeing is an option. And I think like sometimes players feel like that's just as bad as losing the combat, but if you're preserving those points, like
Yeah.
that's still good, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a super important thing to consider, and we didn't talk about it earlier, and it kind of dovetails well into our next part, which is target selection. But like, especially if you are poorly positioned, or if you're far from the like near the end of their declarable charge range, you can really use flee to force maybe your opponent to end up in a position they don't like, or as Andrew said, just protecting some points. So I think it's a super important tool. You're right. Danny, any other tricks or ideas or strategies relative to movement?
The only one I'm gonna, I guess, talk about is just like the idea of like certain spells allow you to move a second time.
Yeah.
So definitely always think about your opponent if they have any of those spells, like even Walk Between Worlds, which gives you a reserve move. There's that Doom King spell that gives the entire army, or an AOE pretty much of
Yes.
reserve move. Keep those in mind. Like, okay, just because they move doesn't mean they can't move again. Like, we never talked about reserve move, but that's also another really strong ability.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So that's another one that gets you some extra movement in there. And it's the same thing with like drilled. Like, just because something's drilled in a marching column doesn't mean, okay, now I'm going to start a turn. I'm going to go from 5 wide and 4 deep. I'm going to switch it so now I'm a marching column. I'm now going to march or pretty much march 3 times my distance and then use that spell, like have my spell in range to cast so I can use Arcane Urgency to now switch myself back into regular formation to move and pivot into a certain, like another position. So be prepared for those or add that to your list, have that in your repertoire. Because I know dwarves can kind of do it. I know it's not as efficient as it used to be, but they have it. Anyone that can take battle magic with Arcane Urgency can do it.
Yeah.
As long as you have the ability to drill, like always have those in mind.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all I got there.
Yeah, no, that's another good one. I left reserve move off the list, but you're right. Like it is a super impactful one. Okay, let's move on to the second big item in terms of our tactical discussion here, and that is target selection. So what we mean by target selection here is how do you decide what your unit will charge or shoot in the opponent's army, right? How are you making those choices in order to make sure that you're winning your combats, in order to make sure that you're shooting the right targets, like all that kind of stuff, right? Without further ado, we'll go back to Danny here. Danny, what are some of your like general thoughts on target selection, specifically for close combat? Like, what makes you decide, like whether you're going to charge an enemy unit or not? What units you're going to charge at what? Like, and when to not declare charges, for instance. Like, what are your thoughts on this kind of stuff?
So I guess the big thing is like if you look at a unit, kind of understand what their static combat res is, because if they have 3 ranks deep with horde, they'll also have things like banners, BSB, maybe a war banner in there. Like they already have a pretty good unit strength or not unit strength combat res before any wounds are caused. So it's like, can I what is mine to theirs? See what the difference is, and then am I with a charge, am I likely to get a large bonus without taking any back? So just kind of doing that mental math, like, okay, if I'm 4 against his 6 or 7, okay, I need to do at minimum 3 just to tie him. So I need to do more than 3 wounds just to get rid of that. Or do I have anything in my army that can kind of help that? Like first charge, okay, I get rid of the rank bonus, so I can kind of help that out. Maybe trying to kill their BSB to get rid of that bonus as well. Just many of those things. Like if I can't win that, then probably I shouldn't be charging, and maybe just holding back and killing some of the other units. So maybe that unit's like 400 or 500 points. Okay, I'm going to avoid that, but if I can pick up the 150 point unit over here, at least at some points without risking my unit at the same time. So it's always just kind of deciding whether you are able to pick up the points, or if you're effectively or with averages. Like always think of averages when you're doing this mental math. Like don't go for the high, and even still maybe even go for just below like the 40% of the time or something, like whatever the math is, like a little less, so you're expecting less than what your units can kind of do, not what the most they can do, because that's just not going to be a good idea. You're not always going to hit. You're probably not going to roll below average. We've all been there, charging, roll 3 1s, or even in combat 4 attacks, 1 hits or something. So you have to kind of plan for those things. So you have to win the combat without dice rolls, pretty much, is what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
That's one of my things. That's pretty much what I'm thinking out. And then if you can't win the combat, yeah, try to get away from it. Try to avoid those units. If there's something on there like a dragon or something bigger, avoid it. If you don't have any answers to it, try to either feed it some weak units, so that way it might overrun away, or so that they kind of lose control of it. So, or even have it your unit near the edge. So if they overrun, they're going off the board. So that's a turn next turn that dragon can't charge, because the dragon only has 6 turns to charge. It's not probably charging turn 1. So that means it's got 5 turns to charge. If you can remove some more of those turns, it's going to be less efficient than it could be. That's what I've got.
Yep. No, that's excellent. Andrew, do you want to go before I go?
On target selection.
Yeah.
I think less. I'm a little bit more organic with it. So, like first and foremost, I usually have a target in mind for what I want to remove. Usually it's a very points dense unit, or they're big heavy hitter. So I'm trying to look at like what I can do to threaten that. And if it isn't possible, like Danny said, I'm looking at spots where I can pick up easy points. So, if they have a chaff unit like kind of out dicking around doing nothing, am I able to pick that up with range attacks? Is there ways I can remove that piece safely without losing anything on my side for that fight? So again, like my Dark Riders are very good at that. They're very good anti-chaff with their shooting, and chaff is usually a lot lighter of a unit, so sometimes they can just charge in and pick up those points. So I'm thinking about those types of things first. Kind of just like looking at how I can chip away at my opponent's army. So again, it's usually what's the points dense units that I can reasonably remove with the tools I have at my disposal, but then also picking up those 100 points, 150 point units that maybe aren't the most points that they'll give out, but you pick up 3 or 4 of those excuse me, and then all of a sudden you're up 500 points. So all those things add up. And then again, I'm looking at, okay, what's what's their most scary heavy hitter? Do I have a chance to fight it? And if not, how do I move in a way to avoid those things?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. No. So yeah, a few thoughts. I'm a little bit more like planny than you are on this one, Andrew. So like my vision's a little bit different, but I think like games are won or lost on like picking good and bad fights in this game. And I think picking bad fights and going after the wrong targets will absolutely lose you the game. I'll talk about some examples like a bit later on in this section, but and for me, target selection is absolutely like a math game, and you kind of need to run some numbers on a calculator, or I think there's an app for it now, or a website for it. Anyways, I haven't used it, but like you got to run some numbers on a calculator to really get good at this. You've got to be able to think about things like, you know, how many wounds on average does X unit cause to Y unit in my opponent's list, and then when you start to see things in the numbers like, oh crap, my Black Orc Warboss on a Wyvern only does 0.3 wounds on average a turn against, you know, that Chaos Lord on Dragon or whatever. Like, you need to be able to run those numbers to see just how bad some matchups are, or how good they are, or how favorable they are, before you really are able to do this intuitively. And to me, it always goes back to like, what is your plan for winning the game, right? How do different elements of your list match up, and how do you like set the conditions to just sort of win the game? And I think when it comes to target selection, a thing that I've done in the past a lot, and I think is super useful, is, you know, oftentimes if you're going to an event, if you're playing a buddy, or if you're in an online event or what have you there, you'll have the ability to look at your opponent's list ahead of time, and then just start to think about it in terms like from a target selection perspective, and be like, okay, so if I face, I don't know, Andrew's army, like what in my army needs to fight that block of witches, right? And then I'll like start to run some numbers of like, okay, well, it's not going to work with the Wyvern. It's not going to work with, I don't know, an Iron Demon. It's not going to work with, and I just run through it. And then like over time, you start to develop that understanding. So it becomes a little bit easier. But like, I think it at first is definitely a math thing. And you're even like just able to from that initial target selection, like your plan is I think going to develop largely or partially out of that. And you know, this will set you up for the first few turns of the game pretty nicely. So for instance, I gave that example earlier of a few times of fighting that Wood Elf player, Seb, right, where I knew that Tree Man, for instance, was a great target because I'd run the numbers a few times, and then I knew immediately what my first target selection was going to be for X unit in my army to go and catch it, right? So yeah, it'll set you up for the first few turns, and then you'll need to adapt, because it's impossible to predict the game state a few turns down the road. But like, I think it's super useful for that. And then the second part of the question, in terms of what makes me not declare a charge, there's three things usually, maybe four actually. So the first one is if, and Danny talked about this, if like the static combat res of my opponent is greater than my potential damage output, then it's just not going to work, right? And even if it's a flank or what have you, like, not going to declare that charge. The second one is charges that are like near extreme range of my declarable charge range. So if, for instance, making the charge means that I need to roll a 5 or a 6, like, I'm not declaring that charge in most cases. I'm just going to move further away to make it harder for my opponent or whatever. But like, there's nothing worse than a failed charge and then just being left out high and dry with your opponent having an easy charge after. Like, so you really don't want to do that. The third thing is if the math is just atrocious, right? Like I've run it like, no joke, I've run it sometimes on the calculator, and it's like I'm doing 0.1 wounds a turn into this thing. Like, this is not going to work. I have to wail at it for 10 turns before I do a single wound. Like, this not going to declare that charge, obviously. And then the last thing is if your charge and like the result of the combat after leaves you in a position where you're just extremely vulnerable, or in a position that's advantageous to your enemy, like sometimes you've got to lose the battle to win the war type situation, right? Don't throw away pieces by charging things just to charge things, or select targets that'll leave you stranded in just annoying positions. So yeah, those are some of my general thoughts on it. Going back to you, Andrew, like starting from the beginning of the game, like how early in a game are you thinking about target selection? Like, you know, when you rock up to the table and you deploy or early turn one or whatever, like when are you thinking about what in your army needs to fight what in the opponent's army? And then what do you do to ensure that it works out? Yeah.
Basically, the second my opponent hands me their list or puts it down
Yeah.
on the table, I'm already
Exactly.
like, okay, that's scary. Avoid it. Kill that. Kill that. Witches will deal with that. Knights will deal with that. Oh, look at those chaff units. The Dark Riders go there. Like, I'm already thinking, even before we deploy, even before,
Yeah.
we set up the table. Like, the second I see what my opponent has, I'm already thinking, like, okay, those are the units I can pick up easily. These ones are like sort of the medium tier, and then the rest are like, okay, I can't touch that. I don't have the tools to deal with that, or if I do, it'll be very late game once I've kind of cleared up the rest of the shit. And then I kind of generally know. I mean, I know you kind of alluded to like me not running the math, and it's like maybe not, but I do know the capabilities of my unit.
Sure.
So like
Yeah. Yeah.
I know what my witches can handle and what they can't. I know what my Dark Riders can, or not my Dark Riders, but my Cold One Knights can handle and what they can't. So like I already have that kind of general knowledge, and like maybe
Yeah.
I overestimate the capabilities of some of my stuff, but I also underestimate the capabilities of some of my stuff. So like I kind of generally know what my army can handle.
Sure. Yeah.
So going into the match, like once I see what my opponent brings, like I'm already formulating like plans. I'm like, okay, so I need to set up that the witches go here, the Charybdis goes after this, or supports, the knights because they're gonna need some backup on this thing. So I am thinking about that like right away.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer that I agree with. What about you, Danny?
I mean, like Andrew said, just as soon as you see your opponent's list, you know what you're going to be worried about. Like if you have answers to something, if you don't have answers to something, you're already thinking about how to avoid that, how to deal with it. So cannons, if you have a bunch of like a dragon or two, and they have 6 cannons, okay, where do I position? How do I move across this board to avoid things to get to the cannons? How do I get away? How do I deal with all these different things? I mean, I don't have much more to add that he hasn't already covered.
Well, even
Yeah.
with
No.
that, like
Yeah.
you're thinking also like, how do I deploy the terrain?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And pick it like depending on the event. Sometimes it's pre-made maps. Sometimes like some of our events,
Yeah,
they're
like
all you get
I
to
guess
place
if you
the
have
pieces.
control of it, sure, yeah,
Yeah,
but
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, or if it's pre-placed, then which side am I going to pick, or which quarter am I going to pick for that
yeah,
encirclement mission, or whatever, right?
yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah.
So, no, I agree with you guys. I think about it immediately as soon as I see my opponent's list. I think I mentioned this before, but the plan I come up with is largely based on what needs to fight what in the enemy army, and then what I need to avoid, like the plague. So yeah, this is something you need to think about as early as possible, and then to sort of ensure that I can line it up the way that I want. I think there's a few things. So and we've talked about them already, but like first one is deployment. It's critical, and we'll be talking about it like a bit later probably also, but like making sure that I deploy in a way that allows my units to reach their intended targets, the targets that I've selected for them, is key and potentially the most important thing you can do. The second one is thinking of threat ranges, because if you don't keep that in mind, you're going to have some nasty surprises along the way that are going to prevent you from getting to the right targets, or going to make it so that those targets get to the wrong things in your army. So that's definitely another one. And then like you can also leverage stuff like terrain, or you can also use stuff like redirectors or chaff units to just allow you to set the conditions to get those charges off. Like, don't take your eye off the prize. Like, those things need to happen for me to win the game, and then you need to do everything in your power to sort of set those potential charges up later. Okay, so we've talked about close combat. how do you go about selecting targets for shooting or magic? Like, do you plan this out early in the game? Are you looking to cause, like, I don't know, panic checks as like a factor that you consider? How much you factor in minuses to hit? Like, how are you picking those targets? Let's start with Danny.
Definitely for this one, like as we talked about earlier, the threat ranges, understanding what the threat ranges of your own units are, like knowing, okay, there's some skirmishers, there's some fast cav that I really need to get rid of because they're gonna block, they're gonna constantly just be in the way, they're gonna be really annoying. So I have my Demon Prince, who's a level 4 wizard with Fireball or the summoning. Okay, I know he can move 9 plus the spell, so how am I going to be able to move him to get to delete those units? Um, as well as maybe having your wizards in certain ranges, always measuring to see, okay, my spell's range is this. So I need to always just be in range of all these different units. So if I want to have um, a unit that's more defensive, have the wizard in
Yeah.
there. So that way it's self-range spell, it can target it or behind. Or it's like if you're getting prepared for Arcane Urgency, okay, how far can my unit move up from its first move? Maybe it doesn't move its full distance. It only moves 6 inches instead of its 8 inches because my wizard wouldn't be able to keep up with it or won't be in range. So I'm going to keep it back a little bit. So that way I can do a double move, which is much more advantageous than just, moving 2 extra inches on that cavalry unit.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's usually you have that kind of plan as you're deploying your units. You can kind of see, okay, I have because characters are put down last. You kind of see where the battlefield's going. You're shooting. I've never really played an army with a ton of shooting. I have tried, and it never seems to go very well for me. That's something I don't have the most experience with, but it's the same kind of similar idea. You know which units or what they can actually take down. So there's no sense firing 10 archers into a dragon. You're probably not going to. You
Exactly.
might, if you're really lucky, get a wound
It's
through.
a math problem. Yeah.
Yeah, like you might get a wound through. Like if it has 1 wound left, sure, and they have nothing else to shoot at, it's probably worth trying to maybe get the math through. But otherwise, like if it's full wounds, there's no point. You might do a wound, still alive and still fully effective. But it's knowing what these units are good for, like having a magic missile, taking a new scoring unit down from 12 to 10 or just under 10 unit strength.
Yeah.
Pretty much makes that unit almost out of the game. Like you didn't get any points, but they're not scoring anymore. They're not able to contest. So they're just like doing a few shots there and here and there. I feel like there's all kinds of different things you can do within your shooting phase or magic.
Yeah.
And I feel like I kind of jumped all over there, but
Yeah, but you have a lot of good points there for sure. Andrew, do you sort of see this the same way as Danny, or?
Yeah, like I know Dark Elves have access to a lot of like really good efficient shooting, but I've never taken those units. You know, like the bolt throwers, the repeater bolt thrower, or the repeater crossbow like units.
Yeah.
Most of my range stuff is the Dark Riders, who are fast moving skirmishers, on cav units, and more recently the Shades. So I use them a lot more differently. Like I use them very organically in the game where they're picking up those targets of opportunity. You know, again, if chaff pushes too far in a certain direction, they'll go charge that or deal with that. Or, a lone caster maybe got a little too far away from their parent unit. Um, so maybe I can pick them off at range. So for them it's more I have to look at the game state before I decide what those targets are, and how do I move in a certain way to capitalize on those targets of opportunity. But then with like my caster, like Danny said, I'm thinking about ranges of spells. So for all my like buffs and conveyance spells, I'm making sure I'm staying within range of my units. I run my caster on a Dark Pegasus and she floats around alone. So I'm making sure she's either staying close to either the Dark Riders or the Cold One Knights so she can at least get some of that benefit of defensiveness.
Yeah.
Staying within that sort of 3-inch range without being the closest target. So I'm thinking of those types of things and moving her in ways that keeps her protected from my opponent's ranged attacks. Um, so I think I have with my caster, I have more of a plan than say the Shades and the Dark Riders, because they kind of go out and pick up what they can. Whereas, with the magic, I'm really thinking about, okay, how do I keep her safe, but
Yeah.
also have that threat radius around her, and make sure that I'm either picking up targets with her, or at least influencing how my opponent's going to move around, with knowing that she's a threat within my army.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with both of you, generally speaking. So from my perspective, when it comes to target selection for range damage, I think it's easier to do with range damage than with close combat. Close combat, just because your units will have a much longer, further threat range. So you don't need as much planning. Like, you don't need to go down these, like, specifically need to target this before the game. Like, you have more leeway because you can reach out and touch more things. But yeah, so there's that. Like, it's a bit less planning intensive for sure because of the added threat range. And I think, like, it boils down for me to what is shooting trying to do in my army and in my game plan. Like, is shooting my main damage output, or my, like, quote unquote, my hammer in my army? If that's the case, like, if I'm I don't know, a null player of the gun line, or if I'm in the good old days of edition 1, or like the start of the edition, if I'm a big block of sisters or poison shooting or whatever, like, then my target selection, like that big shooting unit or that big shooting output, needs to pick up points all the time or remove key pieces from my enemy's army. And then inversely, if shooting is, as it is for the three of us, a utility part of the army, then you have, again, more leeway, but it should be shooting different targets, and you need to be selecting different targets, right? Then maybe your shooting ends up being further on the flanks to target chaff, make sure that it doesn't get in the way of your heavy hitters. Or maybe you use, as Danny was talking about, this is list dependent and case dependent, but you use your shooting to just plink wounds off of unit strength core units and drop them below 10. Like, this is a super useful tactic now. There are plenty of people who run their core units and 12s, 13, 14s, and then they're like a few bad armor saves away from basically being irrelevant to the game, right? So yeah, for me, it depends. It's less planning involved, to sum up, and then it just depends on what role in the army shooting's having. And then, of course, there's always the math bit of shooting is can be a little bit treacherous on the math. So if you're going to have to run the numbers a few times, but you're going to find out that oftentimes your shooting just doesn't do much to heavier units and bulkier units, especially units that have high toughness. So that's also something to consider for sure. Okay, cool. Closing out target selection. What are Andrew, some of the pitfalls that you've seen players stumble into when it comes to target selection, and then how do you avoid them?
I think, like, the biggest one, at least for me, although I've seen my opponents do it as well, is like over what's the word? Like, overestimating the capabilities of their units. So if you've had a lot of success with a certain unit, maybe witches with a heg in it, um, and they've kind of dealt with a lot of scary units in the past, you might think, like, well, they can just deal with everything, so I'm just gonna throw them at a target that maybe they have no business going into. And if I had stopped, to think about it for a second, it's like, ooh, maybe that was a bad matchup. So I think that's kind of like the biggest one, is just like overestimating your unit's capabilities. Bad dice roll happen, and also spikes happen, but you should be looking at those sort of averages. And I think it's easy to get away from that, especially if you have like a very if you've had a game where maybe a unit overperformed, you kind of remember that more than like a game where they underperform. So like might skew your view on like the capabilities of that unit.
Yeah. That's an important one that happens all the freaking time. Danny, any pitfalls you've seen or you've landed in yourself?
It's definitely just understanding, I guess, the understanding what the targets can do. Because sometimes, like taking the time to actually ask your opponent, like, what is the output? What do they actually do in combat? So you know what they can do. If you just like, okay, I know there's a dwarf lord and 20 warriors. Okay, it's just 21 dudes. Like I should be able to clear that out with this unit. And then forgetting that, okay, I don't get charge bonuses. I don't get this. They have a 4+ save. Plus they got something off to bump them to ward save that I forgot about, or I didn't realize that the character had this. It's like just understanding what their units can do, and always ask your opponent and clarify if you've forgotten what does that unit do, because it's hard to remember everything on in this game. There are so many factions, so many units, rules, and every unit has exceptions to those rules and changes. So understanding what those are, and so you know what you're getting into. Because I understand at the beginning of the game, someone's going to run through their army, but 3 turns later, it's been an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you've probably forgotten most of that.
Yeah.
So definitely just double check what those units can do, so you, before you make those charges, know what you're getting into. Okay, I actually do need to avoid that. I don't think I can beat that. So let's just ignore that unit.
Yeah, I agree with both of those, and I'm going to touch both of those a little bit for sure. For me, like the first one that I've seen often is players taking the easy but bad charge. So, when there's multiple options, going for the one that they're pretty sure they're going to make, but which actually results in a pretty bad combat, over going or not even charging in that context, but going for like potentially less likely charge or a slightly more difficult charge, but that you actually have a better chance to actually win the combat after. So, a great example that comes to mind of this is very, very early at the start of the old world, we had an RTT here locally, and in my third game, I was playing against a nomadic WoW player, and this is all fast movers, all big unit, like a big unit of boar boys that's buffed up, that kind of stuff. And so what I did is I deployed my Iron Demons, because that's how I was playing at the time, in front of the rest of my army, because with how the rules were working in those days, like nothing else in my army would really survive that kind of charge. So then, a turn of very effective double Iron Demon shooting or what have you, mowing down some boar boys, my opponent decided to charge the Iron Demon because it was much closer to his boar boys than the rest of my army, which resulted in him losing the combat and then the game. As a result, just because it was not the right target, even though it was a much easier charge. Whereas if he would have either run around or potentially pulled off a longer charge into some of the other units behind those Iron Demons, I'm convinced that he would have swept through them and probably or won the game or been in a very good position. So yeah, that's like an example of just going for easy but bad charges is the first one. The second one is something that we talked about earlier. I forgot who it was out of you two there, but charging instead of, so when it's your turn and it's your charge sub phase of the movement phase, I guess. People have a strong bias towards declaring charges because they're so impactful, and making sure you're the person who gets in first has like a massive impact on combat. So, but there are times, and so that the pitfall is declaring charges because you have the initiative and you have the choice when you probably shouldn't be. So, it's really important to think about what's going to happen in that combat, and then sometimes just refrain. Don't declare a charge. Fly away in a different direction or move backwards instead of charging to make it harder for your opponent to get to you. Because even if you're convinced they'll get to you, at least they'll have only one round of combats before your next turn and not two, right? So that's like that's another one. And this is something Andrew I think talked about earlier, but not planning ahead of time what your target selection is going to be like often leads to you either overestimating or underestimating what a unit can do, and then will just lead to bad combats that way. And then the last thing I will say I've seen as a pitfall, which like often results in people just like piecemeal feeding parts of their army to a bad target, is thinking you need to handle everything in your opponent's army. Like there are plenty of times where you will rock up to a game and your list just does not have an answer to something you're fighting. Do not feel obliged to try and find a solution to crack that nut. Like understanding what you can and cannot do is super important. There are plenty of most games, in fact, there are things in my opponent's army that I will purposefully try to not engage or make it as difficult as possible for them to get charges off, just because there's no point in me just giving them points away by trying to find a way to kill that, I don't know, unkillable Death Star if I don't have the tools for it, right? So and people do that all the time, charge things that they have no business charging, because like I gotta kill them, I guess, it's a kill point game. So yeah, that would be my fourth pitfall. Okay, so let's wrap this one up. So hopefully you've all enjoyed this out there. Some good talk about movement tricks, tips, and strategies. Some talk about target selection. So yeah, closing this out. Let's start with Danny. Anything you want to shout out on your way out?
I got nothing right now. I wish I could be at Capital City, but planning to go to that Toronto event in October, and
Yeah.
that's all I got.
Awesome. Yeah, for my part, I'm for sure going to shout out CCBB, Capital City Bloodbath. Just a really, really great event that's 2 weeks away in our neck of the woods. So make sure you sign up. There's still tickets available for that. Yeah, that's going to be my shout out too for this week. Andrew, what do you want to shout out? I think you might be muted.
You are correct. Yeah, we have a Discord now, so just check that out. The link is in the show notes. You can come talk to us, shoot the shit about Warhammer, see a bunch of cool hobby content, or just see the random things that the people in there are talking about. So it's a good time. It's a good way to, if you ever want to get in contact with us, to, send us a message.
Yeah.
So yeah,
book
check
some
out our
Warhol
Discord.
games with us. Yeah. me
Warhol,
and Ryan,
yeah,
at least.
well,
Yeah.
at least you and Ryan.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect. So thank you for sticking with us through this one, and we'll see you all next time.